Greetings, I'm John Duvall. Welcome back to another Truth Factor discussion. We're so thankful that you've taken time out of your busy schedule to join us for this live Bible study. We meet every Thursday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time as we study the Word of God together. Just a handful of us preachers, we like to get together and have a study, and we invite you to join us. We'd love to have you as a part of our study. If you have any thoughts or comments, you'll have an opportunity to share them with us as we go through the study. We are currently in the Gospel of John. We are picking up in chapter 10, there in verse 40. Today, it is Brian, Tom, and me. I guess that would be the right word to use for the study. Paul's unable to be with us today. Bob is unable to be with us today. And Brandon says he's not feeling well, but, you know, he's one of those young guys, so they make up excuses. But more time for us to speak, I guess. We hope everyone gets feeling better. And Brendan's not. He is feeling bad today, so. How about you? How are you doing? Brian, Tom, y'all faring well?
Real good.
All right, good.
Yeah, getting over a cold, but.
Oh, man, that thing will be persistent.
Yep.
If you have a thought or comment as we go through this study, we'd love to hear from you. If you have joined us on our Facebook page, then use the comment section connected with this video. You know the routine. If you've joined us on our YouTube channel, then you could comment there in the chat area as well. Both our channels are Truth Factor Live, all one word there. And we would definitely love to hear from you. Real quick, if you want to email us, send it to questions@truthfactorlive.com. That's our main email address. But as you can see on the screen there, you can email us individually, john@truthfactor.com, Brian, Tom, etc. And you can contact us that way as well. All right, let's see. We have Caleb who's joined us here today. And we have Eileen Haynes with us. Jimmy's with us also. David, it's good to have you with us too. And anyone else, maybe if this is your first time joining us, drop a note in the comment or chat area and say, I'm Bob from Tallahassee, Florida. Just say hi. Let us know who you are and that you've joined us here today. Getting tired of saying Bob from Minnesota, so I'm going to try to say Bob from Tallahassee, Florida. Some point I'll say Bob from Macon, Georgia. But that'll be Bob on the show, so. All right. So in John chapter 10, as we pick up here, Jesus has just had somewhat of a lengthy conversation in regards to there was an accusation on the part of the Pharisees and so forth against him because he's basically making himself God or the Son of God there, equivalent with God. And of course they took up stones and he was able to evade them and got away from them. And so when we pick up here in verse 40, he is now going to a place called beyond the Jordan. So let's start our reading there, Brian, and we're going to go into the 11th chapter in our reading. Now, before we do that, let's actually just read verses 40 through 41, and we'll discuss that here for a minute.
Just 40 and 41?
Through 42, I'm sorry.
Okay. And he went away again beyond the Jordan to the place where John was baptizing at first, and there he stayed. Then many came to him and said, John performed no sign, but all the things that John spoke about this man were true, and many believed him there.
All right, thank you, sir. So when he says here, he went away again beyond the Jordan, Matthew chapter 19, we kind of see that same thing there. Matter of fact, let me go ahead and bring that up here for just a minute. Over in Matthew chapter 19, there in verse 1, hang on just a minute, my Stream Deck decided to reboot on me. Let's try it again. It is up. Okay, so now it came to pass when Jesus had finished these sayings that he departed from Galilee and came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Now, some notes that I've looked at in regards to that beyond the Jordan, they think he's talking about an area called Perea, P-E-R-E-A. And this was under the territory of Herod Antipas. Now, the significance of that is this was also the same area where John the Baptizer was preaching. And if you remember, it was Herod Antipas, or I think also called Herod the Tetrarch, who was unlawfully married to his brother Philip's wife. And John told them that it was unlawful. And it was that same Herod who, at the petition of Herodias' daughter, acquiesced and beheaded John the Baptizer. And some suggest in Matthew 19, when they pose the question to Jesus, the Pharisees say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? Matthew says they were testing him. Some scholars suggest that they were trying to set Jesus up in hopes that Herod Antipas would turn against him, or maybe it would get back to Herod Antipas that his teaching on marriage and divorce would also basically convict, as John did, would speak out against Herod Antipas there. So I only bring that up, and we'll pause for any comments here, is because coming back to the text, John says he went to a place beyond the Jordan where John the Baptizer was baptizing, and that's where he stayed. So just a little interesting note there. Any thoughts, Brian and Tom?
Not really. Other than we know that Jesus had just left Jerusalem for a feast. One of the neat things in the book of John is that you get that sense more and more how badly they want to kill him. In the next chapter, we're going to see, the ultimate actual steps towards the conspiracy to kill him taking place, but they're so upset that it kind of makes sense that Jesus is withdrawing from their purview to do some more teaching. If we're right, timing wise, the Feast of Dedication is in December, so Jesus is going to be put to death sometime probably around April. So this is just about the last 3 months of Jesus's life that we're going to squeeze into these next couple of chapters.
That's interesting to think about that. Just, because we've got 10 chapters, well, more than 10 chapters left, but as far as within the next 10 chapters, we will quickly get to his death. It's an interesting point. Tom, any thoughts?
Well, we'll get to the week of his death within 2 chapters.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So I mean, it's really that. I just real quick, I just think it's interesting, the observation. John performed no signs.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's interesting to talk about. Brian and I were discussing a little bit earlier before when we first had started the live stream, before we started the study, that's a very important point that the people observed. In their own mindset, they saw a difference between Jesus and John.
And incidentally, that points to the fact that you don't need miracles to share the gospel. I mean, we have some in the, there are some that argue for miracles today and stuff like that, and not necessary. And if a miracle is, I don't know how to rephrase this. If for some reason these people claiming miracles today, it's not for the same reason that miracles were performed in Bible times.
Well, and their observation is, but all things that John spoke about this man were true.
Yeah.
So the what John said about Jesus in Jesus's actions proved true. Part of his actions, of course, would have been the miracles that he did. But you're right. John did not require any miracles to show that his message was from God. Yeah. Also, something to think about here real quick before we move forward. We have short excerpts of John's message. Okay, we know the generalized message: repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And I've come to prepare the way of the one who would follow him, whose shoes I am unworthy to latch, and so forth, or loosen. But you think about however long John did his work. We don't know, do we, how long? The Bible doesn't tell us. Was it 6 months before Jesus began his? Was it a year before Jesus began? We don't know. But there had to be more to what John said. When I mean more to what John said, more expansion to it, still the same message, But, how many other prophecies might John have gone to and talking about the coming of the Messiah. And we look at how much the Old Testament talks about the coming of Jesus. It would not be beyond the realm of possibility that John included much more in his messages, all saying the same thing, but enough so the people would hear and would know to listen to him. I don't know, something to think about.
Hey, something else interesting based on what you just said. When I made the observation, they said John performed no signs.
Yeah.
Understand there is one miracle, at least, that John performed continuously, and that is the miracle of prophecy.
True.
The fact that God was speaking directly to or through him.
Yeah.
I mean that's not natural, so that would be miraculous by definition.
Yeah. He'd have the
And he
Spirit of
was
the
able
Lord
to-
from within the womb.
Exactly, and he was able to see. He was able to see people.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's some things, but the point they're making is he didn't do signs.
Yeah.
He didn't do signs the way that Jesus constantly did, and that's
right.
what we're dealing with in the Gospel of John is several signs that Jesus performed. The idea of a sign being a proof. I mean, think about that word sign. When you think of a sign, what does it do? It gives you information. When you come to a corner of an intersection and you see a red octagon, you know what it says on it. It's giving you information that you need to follow.
Truth Factor, a source of even understanding English language.
Exactly. Well, hey, that's
Good
the only
point,
way
though.
we're going to understand what God said is if we understand
Yeah.
English language.
A sign or a mark or a token.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a good point. All right. Any thoughts on that, Mr. Brian? Is that a sign
I
to
really
go
don't.
forward?
Yeah, I guess so. I don't have much else.
I'll tell you one more thing, and I'm going to ramble just a little bit, but I think it's rather interesting. I think about King Saul. Talking about the Holy Spirit and prophesying, okay? King Saul was given the ability to prophesy shortly after. Remember when he was out looking for the donkeys, and he came across the group of prophets, if my memory is serving me correctly. He had the ability to prophesy. Now, towards the end of his reign, when he fell out of favor with God, he once again would prophesy. All right. And I've often thought that's interesting that in both cases, the Lord still showed him that Saul was not in control, but it was the Lord himself. And y'all remember that story, that account, where he prophesied the second time, but after he fell out of favor with the Lord?
That was the time where he took all of his clothes off and did it too, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
he prophesied all day. Yeah.
It really was out of his control at that point, Yeah. Tom says, that sounds fishy. It's somewhere in the text. Yeah. Okay. So, any thoughts from you at home? We'd love to hear from you. We're getting a little slow start. But ending in verse 52, many believed in him there, talking about Jesus. They're in the place beyond the Jordan. Now remember, they believed John, all right, because they saw the things that Jesus did. They believed what John said about Jesus. Now, having seen the things that Jesus did and performed and said and spoke, pardon me, they now believe in him. Okay. Goes back also to the testimony we talked about before earlier in John chapter 5 and then 8 a little bit too. So, all right. Let's go ahead and hit the next section starting in chapter 11. And we're going to find ourselves eventually making our way back to Bethany. Let's start in verse 1. And let's go ahead and read through this section here. Tom, if you would, let's read verses 1 through 16. I think it'll be a good break point there for that.
You're muted.
Tom, you muted? Okay.
There we go. Okay, verses 1 through 16 of chapter 11.
Yes.
Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. When Jesus heard that, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to his disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. These things he said, and after that he said to them, Our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. Then his disciples said, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get well. However, Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought that he was speaking about taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am going for your sakes and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. Then Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him.
All right, thank you, Mr. Tom. Okay. All right, so let's go back here to verse 1. We're all very familiar with this account. This is a very, isn't it the third time Jesus will raise someone from the dead? And so, but in this case of point, because of his connection with them, and there'll be an aspect of this we'll talk about later that will be bring about a greater, it'll make this event greater than the others, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment there. I'm looking at a comment from Jimmy real quick. Okay. All right, yeah. Jimmy asked a good question. I'll bring that in here in just a moment. So now, he makes a point here. We have the introduction of Lazarus of Bethany, and you have the town of Mary and his sister Martha. So let's go ahead and pop the question up here real quick. Jimmy says, "Is this the only passage in which we learn that Lazarus has a sister, or was this more of the meaning like a sister in Christ?" In this case of point, this was actually Mary and Martha were Lazarus's sisters. The couple instances of the text here, that's the relationship that he's talking about, physical sister there. And we see that in part as we go through the reading here, especially like there in verse 3. But any thoughts about that question?
Yeah, I see it in verse 19 where you have a statement that they're being comforted for the death of their brother. That seems to be pretty good. It's an interesting question because we meet Mary and Martha back in Luke. I'll look at the cross reference, Luke 10:38. And so they have been long-term disciples. This kind of is the first time we find out more about Lazarus. He's not mentioned in Luke. But it is interesting that they all three seem to be disciples of Jesus.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Okay, I popped that up real fast there in the Luke reference that you brought up there. All right, so, and he references, John does in verse 2, it was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So if you're kind of wondering, is this the same Mary who wiped Jesus' feet with the fragrant oil? Yes, it was, if you're wondering that question there. And so verse 3, he says, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. So the message from Mary, she says to Jesus there that Lazarus is sick. Now, let's talk about his reply for just a minute, because many times we wonder, why does certain things happen within the life of Christ? Are they coincidental? Are they accidental? Think about the man at the pool of Bethsaida or Bethesda. Was it accidental? Was it intentional? This really gives us an interesting insight to it, Tom. Tom, you read. Look there at verse number 4. Does this kind of tell us that this was intentional of sort?
In this case, absolutely.
Yeah.
The observation that you made just a moment ago, it's one of those things that is situational. Of course, when you know who Jesus is, being God, being God on earth and so on, obviously he knew everything he needed to know, and he could control anything and everything that he needed to know. But situationally, this is definitely a circumstance where Jesus did what he did with intention.
Yeah.
His delay was intentional and everything else.
But for the glory of God.
Yes.
This is what the sickness is for, ultimately, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. And that's kind of what Jesus says there. Yeah.
Yeah. And incidentally, Bethany, for what it's worth, Bethany was relatively close to Jerusalem. I believe it wasn't very, very far away. So it was in that region that would have been, for lack of a better term, hostile territory, as they were for Jesus. And I'm trying to think. I didn't mark this. Do we know exactly where Jesus is? Obviously, he's not there. More than likely, he's in Galilee. But is there? There's no place that tells us where.
We had him briefly beyond the Jordan.
Yeah. Well,
but now,
we got that.
Apparently, he's come back. Yeah. Or she went to him. One or the other there. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Any additional thoughts on that before we go forward? So now we have the situation here. There is a relationship, relationship between Jesus and Lazarus and his family, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And the Bible doesn't tell us a lot of details other than he loved them, loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So and remember what Mary said, though she came to the Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. So there is a close relationship there, in that he knows them. I don't know how well, of course. I'm talking about more than acquaintances, the way that the description here. It's not like the centurion coming to Jesus. And so then in verse number 5 there, he comments about that. So about his love for them. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. And Tom, you kind of touched on that a moment there. Instead of Jesus leaving immediately, let's hurry up and get him, he intentionally delayed. It will come up a little bit later. But Brian, oftentimes of the miracles that people have seen Jesus do, it's been healing the sick. And I've wondered, other than the example of the widow of Nain and
Jairus' son.
Jairus' son, thank you. I wonder if the general expectation of those who went to him is that they had to get to him before they died. If they wanted to be healed, their loved one was sick, they needed to get to Jesus before they died. Because when you get towards the end of this account, when he gets there, some of their people are saying, don't bother him because Lazarus is already dead. Do you think maybe their expectation wasn't that he could raise him from the dead, but that basically if he didn't heal them, then that would be too late?
Yeah, I do. I think Tom probably was going to hit on this too. At least I'm trying to read Tom's mind on this, that not only is he going to be dead, he's going to be extra dead. That, the other two were at a moment of death. So bringing them back from the dead, I'm always careful not to use the word resurrection. I think the Bible wants us to think of something different with the word resurrection, but raising them from the dead they just died. I get them back. This guy's going to be dead all over. I mean,
this is why I said earlier that this is greater than the other two instances.
Tying to what Brian said, by definition of dead, every definition that the Jews had of dead would apply to Lazarus. If I understand correctly, uh, and I don't know where this would be, it's not in the Bible, but they had a belief that when the spirit separated from the body, there was a lingering for a period of time, a day, or I don't know how long it was, but the 3 to 4 days in the grave is just unmistakably dead.
Yeah. Years
And by the
ago,
way, starting to
sorry.
decay. They didn't embalm them.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not talking Egypt. I mean, that body would immediately start decaying, which is why they wrapped them in the spices like they did, among other things. You know, whatever preserving they could do, they knew what was going to happen.
I'm getting older, so my recall doesn't work as well as it should right when I need it to. It'll come back to me later when I'm doing something unimportant. But back around, I can't remember, 2012, 2013, a lecture was given down at Florida College by, I can't remember the guy's name. He's since passed away. He's real good friends with Russ Bowman. Real good friends. And he presented a lecture down there that talked about the Jesus. He talked about Jesus being in the tomb for 3 days, but he was talking more about Lazarus being in the tomb for 4 days and what the tradition was. And the tradition of the Jews is that they understood that for the process of 3 days, they could still go in and out to the body and finish visiting. Think about when we have a body on display at a cemetery, or I'm sorry, not cemetery, but at a funeral home. They could go in, see it, administer to it, whatever, you know. But by the time the 4th day rolled around, they knew enough to know that the body's starting to stink, and you referenced this, the process of deterioration. And so when we get to that point of the story, they're going to say, no, Lord, I can't open it. He'll stink by now. And so that goes back to what y'all were saying. You know, they from their experience, 4 days in, tombs closed, decomposition, whatever they would have called it back then, was in full swing there. You remember that lecture, Tom? I'm sure you heard it because you were faithful and dutiful about listening to the lectures.
Well, yeah, well, and someone, but no, I don't remember who that was. Or
Oh, that's bugging me. The reason why I say he's real good friends with Russ Bowman is because I remember Russ talking about it on Facebook with his passing. It was a shock because he was a younger person per se, maybe like in his 50s, and but I'm not recalling those names there. Hey, if some of you in the chat room know what I'm talking about, let me know. But that's been a few years ago, and some of y'all would have been significantly younger back then. Caleb, I think. Okay. But we'll get to that. I think that's a very valid point. He wasn't just, you just missed him by 30 minutes. This was, 4 days. Okay. There in verse 8. So he says, let's go to Judea again. And so let's assume for a moment they were still over in the region beyond Jordan. So he says we need to go back to that area there. Brian, they had a problem with him going. Or concern.
Yeah. So as we mentioned earlier, at this point, Jesus has stirred up the Jews. What do we have in John? 3 different times where they've tried to kill him now, and that now it's at a point where his disciples are even saying, "Look, if you show your face down there, there are people that are going to kill you. We just need to stay out of the way." Seems to be the logic and the thinking of that, and so Jesus's conversations here are really, well, it doesn't make sense what we ought to do this, so,
yeah.
And they're not too concerned about Lazarus because Jesus told him in verse 4, don't worry about it. It's not going to be a problem. Which, by the way, if I can go back just for a second and say this,
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the elements of this, of what happens here in chapter 11, is that this is a real test for Jesus's disciples because Jesus seems to have made a big mistake, would be the way you might look at it here. That Jesus messed up and Lazarus died. Because it's very clear, and one of the things the Bible wants us to know, I think that's why there's this statement in verse 5, look, Jesus loves Lazarus. There's no Jesus isn't going to delay because he doesn't really care much about them. Jesus loves these people. And so Jesus is going to, do something that is going to seem, and we're going to see a couple of comments later by Lazarus's sisters. Where were you, Jesus? What's going on? And can you imagine what that would be like if Jesus's disciples said, yeah, Jesus chose not to come. We got your message, and he stayed. He went to bed that night, got up the next day, didn't talk about it. Went to bed that night, got a 2 days passed before he started saying, let's go to Judea, and he didn't even mention Lazarus. So I've really always felt like there's going to be a lot of frustration in some of these conversations that they're going to be having with him. That they just don't, Jesus, where Jesus is going to be frustrated is they just don't see that he is the resurrection, that he is life. Not just raising people from the dead, which is bringing their spirit back to the body and restoring whatever damage is done. The resurrection is to create a whole new body, which is quite a bit more incredible. And Jesus is that's who I am. I am the walking resurrection, and nobody gets it, and they'll run up to him and say, well, we believe in the resurrection. I am the resurrection. I showed up here. Anything can happen. So I do like to kind of get that feel early on of maybe a frustration, that Jesus is delaying, and that's going to build a lot of people that are going to really say some hard things, and we're going to see a lot of conversations where they're going to laugh at him when they say, oh, he look at him, where Martha says, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. That's twice that they'll say, if you had just been here, he wouldn't have died. And then the other Jews are going to say, if he had just come, this wouldn't have happened. So there's a lot of blame. And it's kind of funny because, we still blame God for all sorts of things. Something goes wrong in our life and we blame God. God, if you'd have just listened to me, or if you just, and we never see we never see that God might have a big picture view of things. But we're still bad about, I believe in you, God, but maybe I blame you for some things too. And I think one of the things I like to kind of point out is how Jesus will groan several times. Oh, kind of that, don't you guys get it? Don't you really see, the bigger picture here? And we don't, and they didn't either. And I really think that's one of the neat things in this account is that Jesus is intentionally dragging his feet. Yeah. Everybody's going to know that, it seems like, and everybody's going to be upset. And again, maybe I'm reading in a little bit, but I think it's probably almost a necessary inference, if not just a clear inference, that they're all pretty upset by Jesus having delayed, and that Jesus is kind of frustrated that they think that matters. So
I think it's good. Yeah. Good point. All right, let's see. All right. So let's look at his reply here for just a moment. Ryan just stunned me with what he said, so that's why I'm kind of slow to get started. I got busy looking for, I think it was the 2013 lectures, because that was about the resurrection of Jesus. And I'll eventually come back to what I was trying to recall here in a minute. All right, so continuing now, they express their concern. And Jesus makes a statement here, and I thought this was interesting as we went through this. Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. These things he said, and after that he said to them, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. All right, first, let's talk about verse 9 here and verse 10 for just a moment. He says, if anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of the world. If anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. What's his point? What do y'all think about that? What would be his point behind verse 9 and 10?
Jesus said this back in chapter 9. I've got to do certain works while I'm here. I have to do certain things. He said back in chapter 9, look, I while I'm here, I'm the light of the world. While I'm here, there's certain things you need to, and maybe we can even say certain things you need to see me doing. So, this being one of the key things about what we're talking about here, that this is something key. You need to see me doing some things. And one of them is going to be You need to see, well, I think what he's about really is about to happen is you need to see me overcome death in this instance so that you know I can overcome death in every instance. So I kind of feel like that's, the reference here. And going back, like I said, in John 9, looking at my cross references here, John 9:4, he had said, I need to do certain things while I'm here. And that's been a pretty common statement he's made.
I think that's close to what he's talking about there.
Yeah.
And as long as he's with them, they have the light with them.
Yeah, he also I also see in this expression, I know what I'm doing. I mean, yeah. In other words, don't you know they're trying to stone you? Yeah, I know that. But it ain't going to happen yet. I mean, I know what's going to happen, and he's basically saying, you know what, don't be. I'm not being reckless. From the standpoint, everything's happening exactly as I planned for it to happen. It's happening as if there's light exposing what is happening. I'm not doing it in the darkness where things are lurking that I can't see. So I see that at least as an aside to the point, but I think the ultimate point is like what Brian was saying.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's a good point. All right. So then he says to them very directly, he says, our friend Lazarus sleeps. Now, when we hear that phrase, what do we think? Well, he's sleeping. And that's what they would have heard. But I find it interesting, the number of times in the scriptures that death is referred to as sleeping. When I think about, especially in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, there when he talks about those, let me bring it up here real quick. The terminology that Paul uses there in regards to those who have already died, in talking about when the Lord comes again. And if memory serves correctly, there in verse 14, for if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. And we kind of see a little footnote there, brings up the idea, or through Jesus sleeps, I guess would be another way of wording that. So it's comforting to see the idea of death being viewed as sleep, because with sleep, you always wake up. We're talking about literally sleeping. You will always wake up. In this case in point, it shows us that the death is not the end. That we will, if you would, in a sense, wake up at some point. Don't take that quite as literally as what I mean, but meaning, we when we die, there will be something next, and we know what it is based on the biblical promises and everything. But they didn't understand that, though, Brian. They didn't understand that he wasn't referring simply to sleeping. Yeah. David says, is that another parable? Looking back at verses, I think it means 9 and 10. Not so much as a parable, but as a simple, basic statement. What do they call those? And I probably shouldn't be asking this because I'm asking because I don't have the answer. What do they call those phrases that oftentimes you will say? They're very basic, very simple, and they state a simple truth, but maybe they don't have something specific behind it.
Are you thinking like an allegory, maybe, or
I don't know. I didn't graduate college as an English major, even an English minor, or even English corporal. I mean, it was just. So anyway, we have those common phrases that we would use to basically make a simple, truthful statement. But it depends on the context as to what you're referencing, and that's what he's looking at here in verses 9 and 10.
Would you say like rhetorical?
Rhetorical?
That may not be exactly right, but
for the sake of making us
it's
sound
obvious
smart,
statement. Yeah.
sure. No, rhetorical is different than that, I think. All righty. All right. So what was their reply? Jesus says he's sleeping. Well, the reply was very simple. Well, if he sleeps, he'll get well, right? Lord, if he sleeps, he will get well. However, we know what Jesus was talking about. So he says to them very plainly, Lazarus is dead. And I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. Does it sound almost like a statement of frustration?
It could be. Jesus got this before. If you remember when he raised Jairus, I said his son earlier. I think it was his daughter.
Yeah.
When he raised Jairus' daughter, that they all kind of laughed at him when, well, she's sleeping. Oh, he's, haha, what a silly thing to say. So it is interesting. But what I think is so interesting, and I like what you said, John, because, from the divine perspective, all human death is just sleeping, because God can wake us up, because there's this sense that, none of it lasts forever. So from the divine perspective, all death is just a sleeping, that God can wake us up from.
That's true. And he gives us comfort. Yeah. Tom, what about that? Now, the reason why I asked about the frustration is in part due to Mark. Mark's gospel, there were a couple times when Jesus is talking to his disciples, his apostles even, trying to explain something to them. And Mark refers to them as being stiff-necked, if memory serves correctly. And it's not in the typical way he would refer to the Pharisees and the scribes, but it just kind of means that they weren't getting it. They just hadn't gotten the message that he's trying to make, or the point he was trying to get across. And so, in this case in point, he says, I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there. Why? He says that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. All right. What do you think in the chat room? You got any thoughts or comments about that? Let us know. We would definitely love to hear from you.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
John, tying it into that, I don't know that I see frustration in this particular circumstance, because Jesus, he was saying something that was should have been easy to understand. When you talk about rules of interpretation, which I'm actually preaching on that right now, dealing with Bible study and so on. One of the primary rules is, when it comes to words, you give it its primary meaning unless there's a reason not to. It's clear that the word Jesus used is sleeps. And so they asked the question in this case. Well, we all know that one of the things you need to do when you're sick is sleep. So maybe he's going to get better. And so when Jesus says, I'm glad for your sakes I was not there, I just think he's making an observation about everything he said. Not necessarily frustration, but just making the point to him, Lazarus is dead. And you're going to see the significance of this. So he's building them up.
I said frustration because I'm trying to lay the groundwork for something I anticipate Brian saying later. Kind of a long play. But Brian, I kind of get the sense that he's also used this term before in reference to someone who is dead.
Right. We were mentioning earlier Jairus' daughter, and I threw the scriptures up in our chat rooms, and again, the point I wanted to make there was that Jesus said she's not dead, she's sleeping, and all the three accounts said, well, they ridicule him for that, and I don't think, like I said, I don't see necessarily a ridicule here or anything here. Thomas's statement has always been interesting to me. Thomas's statement, number one, it's just Thomas. Really, they all love Lazarus. Lazarus, Mary, and Martha have hosted him before. They've taken him in before. That they must have the same affection Jesus has for him. Thomas could just be saying, "Oh, if he's dead, we're gonna die." Thomas could be saying that let's go mourn with them. That it could be more of a statement about going to mourn with them. We're gonna go to his funeral. Let's go to his funeral. Kind of a statement. Let's go be in his death with him in that moment. And there is a question about if the apostles, as I said, there has to be a sense of Jesus. If he just died and you knew that, why have we been waiting here? And again, that's going to come up later. That's what Mary and Martha are both going to kind of bring up later, and the Jews around there are going to bring up later. I have to believe his disciples are probably thinking something similar. So I've even wondered if maybe something Thomas is saying there is, I don't know. I like to think, I like to talk sometimes about the way nihilism comes into our culture, and this everybody embraces death and it's just we're all going to die kind of mindset. Um, is Thomas saying something like that? Probably the first 2 points would be more accurate.
I hadn't thought about it that standpoint. In reference to who is Thomas referencing when he says, "Let us that we may die with him." What you're talking about there?
Yeah. You know, but there is one other observation within the text.
Or be with him in death. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. There is the one other observation in the text here, and that is the fact that when Jesus says, "I need to go see him," and they question him about Judah going, said, "Aren't they looking for you?" And you do. Matter of fact, verse 8, aren't they? The Jews sought to stone you, put you
That's
to
a good
death.
point.
So,
That's a good point.
so I could kind of tie that into what Thomas is saying here. Is I'm willing to go. He's most of his disciples. I'm willing to go with him to death.
Yeah.
I'm willing to die for him. So I could see it literal from that standpoint. And again, that's one thing we don't have the background content of these things. So.
I like what Brian said a while ago, but I more agree with what Tom said. How about that?
Tom's got a great point. It's a good point.
Yeah, because
but let's not glorify Tom any more than we have to.
Well, we've already said once. You already said that Thomas made a great point.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been
he
sitting
took
here
that
and
to
having
heart.
to calm myself down.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. All right. So who do you think is right at home, Brian or Tom? We'll let you vote in the comments below, and then we'll adjust. I'm kidding. We won't make any adjustments based on voting. All right. So let's continue now. It's about 11:52. We've got just a few minutes remaining. Let's go ahead and read the next section there. Brian, if you would, we'll throw it back to you. And let's read 17 through 27, I believe. We'll look at that section there.
Okay, I'll be reading out the New King James Version. Okay. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him, but Mary was sitting in the house. Then Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world."
All right, thank you, sir. All right, so there's probably more in the context than we really have time for. But let's go back to verse 17. So when he got there, he had already been in the tomb for how many days now? 4 days, yeah. I was hoping by now my memory would recall the fella. But anyway, it's not. I'll find it later. So 4 days. By tradition, 3 days, the tomb would be open. The thing about Jesus is a great case in point. Although they had to complete his burial process, but she was able to go back to the tomb on the 3rd day. And I didn't really think about bringing that up earlier. Remember, they had him in the tomb before the Sabbath day, but the women were going back to the tomb to visit him. And he rose on the 3rd day. So this could be looking at that, why they were going back. And much to their surprise, what they found there was completely unexpected, to them. In this case in point, Lazarus had been in there for 4 days. The tomb had already been rolled shut, or sealed up there, I guess, if you would there. Now, Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away. Thomas, I think maybe you earlier made a reference to how close Bethany was there to Jerusalem. And many of the Jews had joined the women there, Mary and Martha, to comfort them concerning their brother. But as we come down in the text here, it's interesting to see Martha's reply. And Brian, this goes back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier. What was their expectation if he didn't make it there while the person was still living?
Well, it is interesting that her statement there is, in verse 22, I know whatever you ask of God, God will give you. So,
yeah,
does she think, I do kind of wonder what's going on because of some of the question here. When Jesus is in verse 23, your brother's going to come back. And she says, well, I know he'll come back in the resurrection.
Right.
So I'm not sure, but it does sound like maybe she's saying, I know, Jesus, that if you ask the Father, he'd let you raise Lazarus from the dead. I think, by the way, I want to kind of pause and say, I think that part of the thought here is too, that when Jesus, kind of goes into this, if you ask the Father, he'll do this for you, which I don't mean to say is incorrect, but I think Jesus also, verse 25, wants her to say, but even Jesus has the power to do this because Jesus is God. That there's even a sense when Jesus says, I am the resurrection. I'm the life that your brother's going to have. So there's a sense of that as well. Jesus trying to draw our attention to his connection to this. But yeah, going back, it almost sounds verse 22 that maybe she believes that even now Jesus can still bring him back from the dead.
Well, but more what I was referencing, and you're right about that, is her statement in 21. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But then going back to what you said, but she even I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Yeah.
I do think verse 21, because of the repetition of it in this, in what's happening in the following passages, probably is a bit of an accusation. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, what's interesting is he's been dead. Let me put this together. He's been dead 4 days. Jesus only delayed 2 days. So Jesus couldn't have, by the time he got the message, had it merely been human, calculations, he wouldn't have made it in time. So, even then, there's a question about Jesus's delay. How significant was that? But I think the delay has got to be something that they're all thinking about. But again, I do think verse 21 is a very soft criticism. If you'd have just been here, this wouldn't have happened. And Jesus he's out beyond Galilee, beyond the Jordan. He's out, in the middle of nowhere. If you'd have just been where you belong, in our area, in Judea, if you'd have just been in this area, this all wouldn't have happened. And like I said, it's human nature to when a tragedy happens, to want to find something to blame. Everybody wants to blame something. And so I think that's, again, reading a little further into the text, but I also think it's probably an inference based on the repetition of this statement.
Yeah.
And
it's understandable.
Yeah. And, building on that a little bit, I can't help but think, how we discuss the purpose of miracles.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's to provoke belief. One of the things that's clear about the miracles that Jesus did, they weren't just about appeasing his friends, or doing something for his friends. That it always served the purpose of establishing who he was. Now, I know there's some possible exceptions to that. For example, the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. So you have a family member being healed in that particular circumstance, but that was very, very early on. So I kind of wonder if there's a little bit of a misunderstanding. There's a knowing, and I agree with Brian. She knew that Jesus could have healed him. She knew you could have healed him, but was that a complete understanding of the whole purpose of miracles? Not self-serving, not turning rocks to bread. or something to that effect. So I find all that interesting, but I definitely agree the rebuke, like mild, and like I said, I mean, I don't think rebuke's a good word.
Yeah,
No, no,
yeah,
no.
Brian's
you're right.
probably with me on
You're
that,
right.
struggling to find the right word to
Yeah.
describe
Yeah,
the
I
way
agree
that he's
completely.
saying that.
It's not rebuke. It's just this. If you'd have just been here, it would have gone differently.
You know
Tom, you
what?
said
Maybe
Yeah.
something.
frustration.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. What you said is so interesting, Tom. And I forgot to mention it earlier. You said that what's interesting about this miracle is that it reminds us that miracles aren't self-serving. And Tom, that's actually a profoundly important point here, where you know Jesus' disciples don't want to suffer. They want to have to see their brother die, all these things. But Jesus knows this miracle is more important than that. But I've always wondered about, I'm glad I didn't go. When Jesus says, I'm glad for your sake I didn't go. And Tom, I've always wondered if Jesus isn't saying it would have been a lot harder not to save his life if we were there and you guys were all begging me, please save his life, as he's dying, as opposed to being here and him dying and then coming later. And I've always kind of wondered if maybe even that's where Jesus says, I'm glad for your sake I wasn't there, because you would have begged me to save him, and it would have been that much worse. And so, Tom, I think you said something really important. Jesus's miracles are never self-serving. We always think they are. We always think, personally, boy, I'd love it if Jesus gave me all my hair back. Just for the sake of, I want my problem fixed. And of course, what's funny about that is every time Jesus does a miracle that has kind of a self-serving, not every time, but literally 9 times out of 10, the people go off and don't give Jesus any thanks. They just go back to their life. And I'm thinking of the 10 lepers Jesus healed, and only one comes back. But it's interesting because that's not the point of miracles. People are ungrateful, generally speaking. If God raises, if God cures me of my hair going away and gives me my hair back, I might thank him for a minute or two, but then I'll start complaining about all the shampoo I got to buy, or how expensive haircuts are. That's how people are. Tom, what you're saying is so important here, because this is utterly not a self-serving miracle, not self-serving to Jesus's disciples even. This isn't even to Lazarus's benefit. This is for all of us to see Jesus has the power over death. And I just think that's a really important point, Tom. I just really like you said it.
Right. Yeah. And think about that. Uh, where was Lazarus after he died? Was his Abraham's bosom interrupted? Was he there? We don't know. By the way, this is not the Lazarus that went to Abraham's bosom. I've always found that interesting too. Tying that in. But yeah, tie all that point in here. Jesus waited long enough that what he did for him could serve a purpose, to promote believers. And by the way, I'm fully convinced that as Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, he was also healed of whatever sickness was there before he died. In other words, he didn't come back. He didn't come back from the dead
Yeah.
barely alive again. Whatever it was that caused it was taken care of.
Let's plan next week to pick up with verse 23. It's kind of an awkward starting point, but we want to come back to Jesus telling her, your brother will rise again, and what she thinks Jesus is talking about. And and y'all have already touched on this, so I'm trying not to say it much longer, but they had been with Jesus so much, there's no telling how many miracles they've seen him do. How many times people were sick and they were present when he healed them. Now it's their turn. And if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. But we know that God hears you. So it's natural. You're right. It wasn't a rebuke of Jesus, not the way that we would think of it. It was just, they saw him coming, and the first thing out of their mind would be, Lord, if you'd been here. But there was a definite purpose behind this, and it's going to be amazing. It'll be amazing. All right. So what do you think? 23 starting point next week? Okay. Sounds good.
You're running the show. We'll start what you say.
All
I
right.
mean, we're on the board, but you're the president.
Really? Oh,
And we don't get a vote. So
I
Yeah,
feel an impeachment coming.
yeah. And by the way, board can mean two different things. So
Oh, there you go.
different
Thank you.
spellings, but
All right, I'll tell you what. Let's plan to continue then next Thursday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time, here in John chapter 11, verse 23, with Jesus' reply to Martha here. I want to thank you so much for joining us for our study. I know we've gone a little bit long as far as the top of the hour. If you would like to contact us, you can send your questions and comments and so forth after the study is done. Send it to questions@truthfactorlive.com. And if it's something that we can address through email, we will. If it's something we can bring into our study, we will do that also. That's questions@truthfactorlive.com. All right, thank you so much. And Lord willing, we'll see y'all back here again next Thursday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time. You have a wonderful week.